some news. Tickets for the Conference on Religious Trauma, Court 2023, are now available. Also, if you're interested in an ad-free version of the Divorcing Religion podcast, come join me over on Patreon. Links for both are in the show notes. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in today to the Divorcing Religion podcast. I'm your host, Janice Selby. I'm a registered professional counselor and a religious recovery consultant. Connie A. Baker is my guest today. Connie is a licensed professional counselor who specializes in recovery from religious abuse. Connie's life mission is to educate, validate, and advocate for religious abuse survivors. In 1990, she suffered life-shattering spiritual abuse and had no one to talk with about it. At that time, very few resources were available to help with spiritual abuse recovery. Not wanting anyone else to lack support, Connie set to work creating such resources. In addition to attaining her Master of Arts in Counseling degree and working as a licensed professional counselor in Portland, Oregon, Connie has been a university counseling instructor, seminar teacher, and clinical supervisor. Connie's book is called Traumatized by Religious Abuse: Discover the Cultures and Systems of Religious Abuse and Reclaim Your Personal Power. She's also developed an online course about religious abuse and a card deck filled with deconstruction and reconstruction type questions, which I think is a fabulous idea. When we recently met over Zoom, I wished we lived closer because Connie, in my professional opinion, is a hoot. Connie A. Baker, welcome to the Divorcing Religion podcast.
I love that introduction. A hoot is probably one of the best things I love that. Bring it. Yes. Oh, totally. We would have a lot in common, Janice, if we lived a little closer. So, yes.
I think so, too. And you're not even that far away with me being in British Columbia and you being in Oregon. Just a hop, skip, and a jump. I might end up on your doorstep one day.
I love that. Just show up. That's awesome. I'm so happy to be here today, Janice. This is really delightful. You told me about, your audience and, what they're going through. And I'm like, yes, please. This is tremendous. I'd love to be able to connect with them.
I'm so glad that you could make it. When one of my listeners actually, or someone who attended one of my conferences on religious trauma, recommended that I reach out to you. They had heard your story. And so then I quickly found you on the internet and watched you talking about your own situation, what you'd gone through. And there was so much that resonated. I felt with the people that I consult with and counsel that I wanted to get you on here. I'm hoping that you'll take us back and talk to us about what first got you on this journey about helping people recover from religious and spiritual abuse.
Yes. Oh, Janice, I can tell my 1-minute story, my 5-minute, 10-minute, 15. Let's go for what? 5 maybe? I don't know.
Go for it. Yep, okay. Get us there.
Oh, yeah. Well, there's always, our stories. I can talk forever. So, I was born and raised in a Christian home. My mom and dad became very, I'm going to call it evangelical when I was like 3 or 4 years old. So my mom had been raised Methodist, my dad, Seventh-day Adventist. Neither of them had been really, really into it. But when they got into it was when I was young enough to not remember, 3 years old. And so I was raised in a country church that was, let's just, for the sake of saying, let's say it was Baptist-y. It was a community church, but in terms of theology, and this was back in when dinosaurs roamed the earth, back in the 60s and 70s. And so I grew up in that culture. And I was a firstborn of 2 firstborns, pardon my twitch, right? And they were young. So there was a lot of rigidity. There was a lot of conformity. I was praised through my childhood and teen years for being compliant. I was a compliant firstborn. And looking back, it's like, oh my goodness, yikes. But if I'm supposed to follow Jesus, I'm going to do it. I'm going, I'm all in. Okay, so what do you do when you do that? You go toward being a missionary. So I go to Bible school, conservative Bible school, heading toward the mission field. Okay, so that's the context of my growing up years. I started going to church at 19 years old that I fell in love with. I mean, I loved what it was doing. I loved the community. It was very missions oriented. So I'm like all in. I won't say much more, just not to trigger us, okay? But that was my life, and I think my guess is probably a lot of the listeners' lives. And so I was all in, and I gave my heart and soul to this place. Well, when my second week, I attended the church. I met a pastor. There was no senior pastor. It was what's called elder rule. Anyway, so this guy, I met him. He says, "Hey," I said, "I love this church. I'm so excited." And he said, "Well, if you have any questions, come see me." And I'm like, okay. Well, this guy is like 3 years younger than my dad, married, 7 children. Okay. If you haven't heard my story, you probably can tell where this is going. 5 years later, 5 years of grooming for sexual abuse later, which I did not see coming. I'm now 25, and he starts making sexual advances. I am distraught. I'm like, what is happening to my life? And I go, just horrific panic and everything going on. Well, I'm also a raging codependent because I have been raised in the church as a woman in particular. And I'm all about, and my family, my mom's done a lot of growing since then, but boy, she was also a raging codependent who had to take care. Well, even my dad had to take care of everybody in his own way. And so what happens is this pastor now says, I'm going through my own sexual abuse recovery. Well, I didn't even say recovery. He says, I'm falling apart because of my own sexual abuse. And if you leave this relationship, I've got a gun by my bed and I'll kill myself. And so there I'm like, I made the profoundly sad, in retrospect, sad, but very deliberate decision that I could handle my life being destroyed more than I could handle feeling responsible for his suicide. And I remember that being a very, very concrete decision. And I hurt for that 25-year-old girl. I had no other resources. Honestly, in retrospect, I think now I'd be like, well, dang, hope it don't have bullets. I mean, because that's your stuff now. I'm an old, crusty 58-year-old now. I'm like, no, that's your stuff, not mine, But back at 25, I don't know whether I could have borne the weight of him committing suicide because I pulled out of this horrible connection. So I was stuck in that relationship for about 9 months, pulling away, moving forward, pulling away, getting pulled back in again. And finally, I left the area. I went 300 miles south to my hometown in Southern Oregon and waited to kind of see what was going to happen. I quit my job. I didn't know how this was going to play out. Like I ran. I had to get away physically. And within a couple weeks, I received a letter from my abuser saying, I'm telling the church leadership, which I actually had been asking him to, because I was hoping I would receive some protection from the church leadership in this situation. And my conscience was blown to shreds. Now, I'm a little old for the actual purity culture, but I was raised in the 60s and 70s, and it basically was the purity culture without that label. And so now I am the scarlet letter. I am, I'm a slut. And the funny thing is, in retrospect, we didn't even have full sex. I mean, it was just, he kept pushing me and I kept pushing away, and I was able to do that. But in the long run, it didn't matter because I ended up, when he told the church leadership, he also took off across the country at the same time. So he split. I ran back to Portland to say, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, basically. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Help. And they got mad at me. Their anger was turned toward me. They blamed me. And in our church, that church that I was going to, there was public church discipline on a semi-regular basis.
Oh, no.
And I knew that. And so I got up in front of 2 church services and confessed my sin. For those of you listening audio, I'm doing quote marks with my fingers. So I confessed my sin to this church, 2 services, and then was told, you know what, the pastor and his family need to heal. You need to leave. So I had built my whole, from the time I was 17 till I was 25, which, when you're young, those are long, important years. Mm-hmm. And I built my life to that point in Portland. And that's all I wanted, all I knew, all I cared about was my best friends, my community, everything. And I was told, no, the church is for him and his family to heal. Okay. So I go to Southern Oregon. I am suicidal, depressed, panic attacks. I mean, I didn't understand PTSD back then. I wasn't a therapist. I was a nice little missionary girl going, and if you do things right, you feel good. It was kind of the weird, bizarre message that you get. And I was freaking out because here now, my reputation is completely shattered. I had been the good girl forever. And now here I am, basically everybody looking at me like a slut. And my world just absolutely caved. So through the months, I wish so much now. Oh my gosh, I wish I could have got on some medication. I wish I could have I went to a Christian counselor, of course, because I'm still immersed in the system. And of course, she blamed me and said, well, what do you need to take responsibility for? The most insane question to ask somebody who's gone through that. Mm-hmm. Now in retrospect, interestingly, I had the sense, I'm kind of proud of that 25-year-old. I had the sense to go, I don't think this is a good fit. I'm like, yes, good, stay away. Well, fast forward 7 years, I get married to a wonderful man, ironically, who's a pastor. Anyway, thank God, he was a wonderful man. He's a great human. And we've gone through a lot since then, with our faith and how we, distance, everything. But I married a pastor within 2 years, which in retrospect, I just kind of, I just have to shrug my shoulders and say, I don't really get that. But it was a very beautiful, good thing. 31 years later, I can say I still really like the guy. So that's a good thing. So I get married. I have my first child. I actually start going to counseling to a different counselor. This would have been in 94, so that 4 years afterwards, because I start thinking, I think that might have been sexual abuse. I mean, spiritual abuse wasn't even on the radar. Nobody was talking about it back then. Mm-hmm. This is ages ago. So I'm like, maybe it was sexual abuse. Actually, it was my husband who, when we were dating early on, I just blurted out my story and he goes, well, that's abuse. I'm like, well, there were abusive elements. He kind of, I think, just rolled his eyes like, no, it was abuse. So that was a gift to me to have somebody say, no, that was abuse. And, so I finally think I probably should go to counseling for this. I'm not a therapist yet, but I believe in counseling. I'm all good with that at this point. And luckily I was raised in a home and a church that didn't totally poo-poo counseling. Like, someone was like, no, that is wrong. It's of the devil, all that crap. So luckily there was some openness to that. So I'm like, okay, I'll go. And this counselor said, oh my gosh, it was total sexual abuse. And I'm like, okay, that helps. And so she helped me walk through that. So really, this is now, I got pregnant. I was going to say, I started counseling, got pregnant, and said, nope, not opening this package, and pulled way back till my daughter was, I think, 1.5 years or so. Then I went back and said, okay, let's readdress this. So we're now 7 years in at this point where I'm going through counseling, trying to sort through stuff. It's just clearly turning into the 10, 15-minute version.
No problem.
Anyway, so I go to counseling. I finally start healing, but nobody, even my really good counselor, doesn't really know how to address the spiritual abuse part. So I'm sitting there and I start doing a little more research and reading the little bit that was available back then. And I'm like, okay, I totally got leveraged by people in power. They manipulated, controlled me, silenced me, shamed me, all of this. I'm like, oh, well, that's abuse. So I'm getting a little more public with my story. I tell it 9 years later, 300 miles away, scared to death to tell my story. And that's why people are, some people kind of take the mode, oh, you need to tell your story. I'm like, I'm careful. No, you don't have to do anything. It could be helpful to tell it to somebody safe, but in terms of public, that's your choice and it's your timetable. And so here 9 years later, I finally have the guts to, stand up actually in front of the church that my husband was still a pastor of. That was, how many years? 27 years ago. And I stood up and told my story, received tremendous support. I was respected in that church. I was also, what I didn't know, because nobody used this term either, I was also deconstructing. I would come home in that church. I would come home after service as a pastor's wife and cry my eyes out and say, going to church just hurts me. It hurts me so bad. And I didn't know why. I didn't know. I made no sense. Nobody else seemed to be going through this. And I always felt very alone. I always talk, listen to all this deconstruction talk the last 4 or 5 years. I'm like, oh my gosh, these people, they've got a community. They've got, at least online, somebody knowing they're not completely alone. And I just think that is wonderful. That takes at least a tiny bit of the agony out of deconstruction. So I was anyway, I told my story. We moved back to Portland to go back to school. That would have been 11 years after my abuse. 13 years after my abuse, I start on my degree as a counselor. So that was in 2003. So at that point, then I'm going through school and I'm like, oh, nobody's talking about this. I need to do, and so I started writing some curriculum to do small group work while I was in school, which is actually now the foundation of at least 2 sections of my book. And I started thinking through how do I want to describe this? And this was, again, before anybody was really talking about it. And my passion, to get to the bottom line, now that you've heard my story, you said it in my introduction, my passion is to all those people. I'm writing the book for me at 25, but it's who don't have access either to therapy, a good therapist who gets it, who are just wandering around saying, what happened to me? Religious trauma is so innately confusing. It is just, I won't use some profanity, but a mind trip, let's say. It is horrible, profoundly confusing. And so if I could have had somebody spell this out for me, here is what it looks like, here's what it does to you, and here's how you get better. My passion has just been that for people who are trying to find their way through such an agonizing, traumatic experience. So that's my story. Important part of my story I actually forgot that I want to say is that in retrospect, the sexual assault part of my story, for me, and this varies from person to person, but for me, accounts for about 25% of the trauma. 75% was how the church handled it. 75% was not about sexual abuse. It was about the horrible leveraging of power against somebody who had way less power, and really destroyed me in so many ways. So that's, I think, an important thing, because a lot of people think, and I know you're your listeners are probably much more advanced than this, but a lot of people think religious abuse or spiritual abuse, oh, it must have been sexual. That's only a part. That there's horrible psychological is the foundation for all of it. There's financial, there's social abuse where you're getting cut off. There's all kinds of expressions of spiritual abuse. And my sexual assault was horrible. And it was still only about 25% of what really did that long-term damage. So, there.
Wow.
So that's the story. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. And I hate to say it, but I think probably there will be more than one person who's listening or watching this who can relate to that, having grown up in a Christian home, and then also, pardon me, really with a very strong motivation and boundaries to be good. Like I'm a good girl. I'm a good person. I don't do bad things, but there is baked right into Christianity the demand for obedience. Yes. And I think children and girls and women especially have this heaped on them, where we're supposed to be polite, we're supposed to be obedient, we're supposed to be caretaking for everybody else, even at our own expense. You're supposed to be a suffering servant, supposed to be a martyr. And so then when we encounter an authority figure, and particularly within the church. So this person, your abuser, he was older than you, so really of fatherly age to you.
I called him my dad in Portland. Yeah, I mean, he was really like a dad for me.
Wow. And then also in a position of power within the church. He wasn't just a congregant. He had a certain position of power, even though maybe he wasn't called pastor. But, and so then he's grooming you throughout those years, building the relationship, building your trust, growing your trust, making you feel safe with him. And then he crosses this line into completely unacceptable and abusive behavior. Can you talk a little bit about how you see codependency as far as relating to religion? Because I feel like it's such a common, huge issue.
Yes. Oh, so much to say. I know that you and I, Janice, were talking earlier about this, and I thought this could be a whole seminar about codependence and religion and how it beads. You know, you've just said a lot of things that codependence at its core, the way I would define it, is having your head in somebody else's stuff rather than yours. I mean, you think about the classic codependence with addiction. You know, most codependents aren't clear on how they feel, what they want, what they need. They are in the addict's head, trying to manage for their own safety and well-being, trying to manage that addict to get them either through power, overt power, or manipulation. And, you know, and they're again, I don't even say that judgmentally. They're going, I'm a recovering codependent. That's not judgmental. But trying to save their own life sometimes with this, because their life is attached to this addict.
It's a coping mechanism.
Yes, they're just trying to survive, and they're trying all these different ways. How can I get this person to stop their addiction? And so they're going to go all over the place, but they are not defining themselves. And this is where even those of you raised, at least in the type of churches I was, the questions, what do I want? What do I need? How do I feel? Are innately, those are not celebrated questions. No. They, in fact, are the opposite of don't be selfish. It doesn't matter what you want. It doesn't matter what you need. It doesn't matter how you feel. There is always this authority structure above us saying, no, here's how you should what you should want, what you should need, how you should feel. Those to me are the three most basic self-definition questions. And I may write a book someday. I already have the title in my head, and it's, what do I want? The hardest question to ask and answer. Because most of us in some way are recovering codependents. We're trying to figure this out, and self-defining and getting clear on me is the opposite of codependence. And so religious structure, by its very nature of an authoritarian umbrella, and often authority in layers. I mean, I was raised fundamentalist, and do you guys say names very often on this thing, or is that
anyway? You can say a name.
Well, I'm thinking the Bill Gothard structure. I was under all this umbrella authority crap. I won't use full profanity today, but just all this yuck that is just absolutely grooms us to be codependent. It grooms us to give away our power. It grooms us to say, it's not about me. Oh my gosh. Even the issue of what did Bill Gothard used to say about anger? Something like, when your rights have been violated, you get angry. And now I go, absolutely. But that was a no-no. It's like, no, you just think you have rights. So you shouldn't be angry because, so this is explicit grooming for codependence. You can't speak for your own sense of self. You can't say, I don't like that. Stop it. It's like,
right.
You're trapped. It's just so devastating. So
it's interesting that you brought up the idea of addiction. So growing up maybe with a parent who struggles with addiction, because religion can absolutely be an addiction. And what I have found is that adult children of alcoholics, ACOA, share a lot of traits and laundry list items with what I call acorns, adult children of religious nuts. They have the same. We have a lot of.
That is so great. Yeah,
we have a lot of crossover there, particularly when it comes to codependency, very poor boundaries, low self-esteem. Well, particularly growing up in a church where you're told that you're nothing without Jesus,
right,
and that your only hope is in becoming a very obedient Christian. Yeah. And I know when I was raising my own daughters, and I was a deeply devout fundamentalist Christian at the time, I wouldn't accept curiosity from them. It had to be stamped out in favor of obedience. Obedience was prized, not curiosity. Curiosity is dangerous because it can lead to questioning, lead to doubt. And, you don't want to be doubting Thomas. You don't want to be sinful by doubting. When really, doubt is the edge of growth. It's right. It's beckoning us to question and learn and grow.
Yeah. And curiosity is such a sweet, beautiful attribute. We have to be curious about life. But we're trained very early. We're trained in dogma, not curiosity. It's like, no, you don't even ask questions. We're going to tell you everything before you even ask. And don't be curious. Yeah. Yes, that whole, the compliance, the good. And there's another factor here. What I've noticed more and more as I work with now hundreds, well, in an extended way, thousands of religious trauma survivors, is that the abuse that happens, the ones who really end up getting abused, I think we still have this horrible stereotype of abuse survivors. They're sweet, they're timid, they don't really speak, they're mousy. And that is just not true. Actually, a lot of times the ones who go through worst religious abuse were a lot like me. I was a leader. I was a go-getter. I made things happen. I was competent. I was confident, as much as I could be appropriately as a woman within the church.
Right.
Because there's limits to that,
Mm-hmm.
But I was out there. I was competent. I was a leader. But deep down, I was also a rule follower, compliant, following the code of the system. And so I think sometimes that gets a little mixed up in our minds when we talk about compliant. That often doesn't mean mousy. I was never mousy. I was a pretty outgoing kid, and even within the church. And I'd be friendly. As we all do, we find out the codes where what you can and can't do and how far you can go. But within that, I was outgoing. I made stuff happen. I mean, I led stuff, and it was all within that code of compliance. And it's never like I never actually questioned the system.
Right.
So I guess I think there's some good distinctions to make sometimes about how we think about ourselves as trauma survivors. And it's like, especially within the faith, no, this is not because I was mousy and quiet and had no voice. I actually did have a type of a voice at 25.
Right. And we also want to make plain that men can be and are and have been also victims of spiritual and religious abuse, and of course, certainly of sexual abuse as well. Yes. And also, some women it's flipped where the woman is the predator. But typically what we see, because of the patriarchal hierarchy in Christian churches, but also in Jewish and Muslim situations as well, and I'm sure others, their predators can climb and rise and slither to the top because they can be either charming, very charming. And to charm is a verb, right? We get charmed by another person, and they know the right language, and they can see people who might make easier victims for them. And that is just so despicable. We put our trust in these leaders, and we are, in fact, we're living the best lives of integrity that we can. We're thinking, well, what makes a good Christian? I am being those things, including being obedient to this person. And the terrible position, the emotional torture, blackmail that you were put into because he threatened self-harm and to end his life. If you left, that is blackmail, emotional blackmail of the highest order. And what a terrible position for any person to be put in. And you're right. We would have a different response to it now than we would have then.
But I was 25 years old. My brain had just got done developing. I mean, I was young. I still, was trying. And that codependence, the really sad thing is, and he knew this, if he would have threatened me with the gun, I could have gotten out. But because I was so groomed in codependence, if it had been me, I'd have been like, okay, you crossed a line. You might take my life, but I'm out. But if it was him, that was that codependent hook. And even that makes me a little sad. That makes me quite sad. For one thing, my life does matter. But it's like we're groomed to say, no, it doesn't. That it's the other person, somebody out there matters. And this guy knew that it was self-harm that was going to hook me and say, I can't live with that. It wasn't even coming after me. And so that the codependence is just so deep in my story and most of our stories. We give it away. Yeah. And I want to say one more thing. Thank you for coming back to the men thing. Some of the worst religious abuse stories I have heard have been from associate pastors, men. horrific. They're caught in the middle. You've got a nasty, narcissistic, power-hungry leader at the top, and the level right below them in a church structure is the one that usually just gets chewed. Just their lives get destroyed. Their family, their income, everything's tied up, and they have to keep secrets for the pastor. I mean, it is that. And so I just want to say, yes, I mean, I'm talking as a woman, but I work with so many men who have just gone through horrific spiritual assault, and religious assault by leadership. So it is not. I thank you for circling back. I really want to highlight that it's a
right.
It's huge.
And I do often recommend, when I hear from former clergy members, or even sometimes from people who still are in roles at their own church, I talk to them about the Clergy Project and encourage them to get in touch with the folks over at the Clergy Project. And also Secular Therapy Project is another good one for people who are recovering from religious abuse, spiritual abuse, religious trauma. I also have a private practice working with people recovering from religious trauma syndrome. And then my conference on religious trauma. You were interested in developing resources to help people, and I am also interested in that. And I have the Divorcing Religion workshop that I run online a few times a year. It's a small group for people who are exploring the religious trauma that they've had, and also coming to an understanding of the depth of their grief. We can't mourn what we don't acknowledge. So there are different types of grief, yes, that are very particular to us when we're recovering from religious trauma, because we've lost our community, our worldview, our identity. There's so much that goes on there. With a lot of my clients, because the folks that come to me, by and large, have left religion altogether, although not all of them. I do also have some folks in my practice who might still consider themselves Christian or agnostic. I'm curious about you. Where would you say that you fall on the belief spectrum? Because you mentioned your husband and you have both also been on a journey around faith.
Big journey, messy, complicated journey, and long. I mean, yes, a long journey. Yeah, that's a great question. And it's not easily answered, partly because I don't have great categories anymore. I don't need so many categories anymore. Here's what I know. I have retained a sense of the spiritual, for sure. And I'm really fine with people who don't. I got on my, it's kind of like you, Janice. I've got people on my docket that are still deeply immersed in church, clear to atheists who are like, why would I ever touch that with a 10-foot pole again? I'm good with all of that, partly because I want to respect the journey that everybody's on. And it doesn't mean I'm going to agree with it. I have people coming in from fundamentalist stuff, perspectives sometimes I listen to it and I'm like, oh my. Luckily, I've had enough years not to get my own buttons super punched by that, but to say this is part of their journey. And my job is to help them figure out who they want to be, and in mental health, become the best person. Well, if they're involved in fundamentalism, there are some stuff that's going to surface, and I don't push that. It's like, but it's going to happen. There's some innately damaging mental health things that take place in fundamental structure of any kind. So that's not hard, and I don't feel the need to push it and say, I don't tell people they've got to get out. Because just like I don't in domestic violence, unless the wife's life is in danger, I don't tell her what she has to do. I don't pay the price for leaving or for staying. And so that's one of my commitments, both to my clients, but also to just humanity in general, to say, you know what? I haven't lived your story. And I may not understand why you stay here fully, but if I go deep enough with you, I think I probably will understand. There, you talk about grief. What a massively high grief price each of us, most of us, I won't say all of us, but most of us have paid for leaving organized religion. The layers are just overwhelming. And so you can't just say, you need to get out. And that's my concern sometimes with therapists who are not religious based, but don't understand religious trauma. See, and this is where, a lot of people go, well, I'm just going to go to somebody who, thinks it's all crazy. It's like, okay. And it's more complicated than that. But anyway, so my therapy life, you're asking me a personal question. I talk about therapy because I think my experiences with these amazing humans that I have as clients have deeply changed and transformed me and altered me. And I'm fine with influenced me. So there was a time, and I'm talking here in 2023, who knows where this will be in 5 to 10 years. But through the years, I gradually left. For about 5 to 7 years, I said, I have 1 foot in evangelicalism and 1 foot out, because I could feel myself getting more and more damaged by both the theology and the culture. And so finally in 2009, I said, I'm out. I didn't make that public. I just knew. I said, there just came a point I go, I'm done. I'm not going back to that perspective. And since then, I didn't know how far I was going to swing. And that was a little scary to me, for many reasons. I'm like, how far am I going to go? And I kind of threw it all up and just said, I don't even know. What do I? And then there came a point a few years later, maybe not even a few years, within a year or two, where I sat down and said, what do I know experientially for Connie? Not because somebody's told me, but what do I know for me? And that was the kind of the ground, the foundation. I started rebuilding something. What do I know? And there again, we're not talking head theology crap. Just in terms of my humanity and my experience as a human, what do I know about the spiritual realm? And so I've just slowly kind of built back a little bit. Even built doesn't sound quite right. It's less of a building metaphor for me and more of a garden or a park. It's like, you uproot bushes, you cut down trees, you plant new stuff. And some of that landscape is there, but spiritually, it's more organic for me at this point. Oh, here's my structure of where I'm at spiritually. So I still carry, we're recording this on the week before Easter, and it's always an interesting time for me to go, what of the Christian faith do I still retain? What of the Buddhist faith have I implemented? I mean, I've just done a lot of different things, gone a lot of different directions to say what's making sense for me spiritually. Right. And so there's parts of the I don't even want to say the word Christian, because I see Christianity as much bigger than evangelicalism, and most people don't, or fundamentalism. But so there's larger ideas from the larger Christian faith that I still, I think, I'm still willing to go with that. But there again, all kinds of beautiful Buddhist thought, metaphysical stuff. So it's just been my own journey. Does that answer the long question?
Yes. And so it sounds like you've moved into a much more expansive space. And life feels better when we can breathe, when we're not in this constricting corset of belief, which is what fundamentalism is. And I would liken it for myself to holding that beach ball under the water for so long, and then the pressure is building. Finally, it's got to emerge from there. You've got to break free. That's how it was for me. Can you tell us a little bit about your cards, your decks of cards. You sent me two of them. One says deconstructing and one says present evaluation. And they're just like, playing card sides. And then they have questions on them. So what gave you the idea for that?
Well, I have a big, it kind of goes back a little before this. I realized one of the passions in my life is seeing people have agency in their life. One of my passions is for them to say, I'm in the driver's seat. I've got the steering wheel. I've got the throttle and the brakes, and I'm driving my life. Because there, again, a lot of religious and codependent people say, okay, you go ahead, you drive, where are we going? And I'm like, no, I love for people to be able to trust themselves, have self-confidence, self-trust, agency. These are things that are just so, so important to me, not just with my clients, but anybody I'm touching. It's like, no, this is yours, go for it. So I started thinking through, okay, well, then that passion merged with my delight in questions and the power of a well-formed question. Mm-hmm. There's some questions that aren't that great. It's like they don't get you where you want to go, but there are some really amazing questions that, if they're formulated well, can expand. You're talking about being expanded, can expand and open us and not close us down. I always give the example of the difference between why did I do that and what might have contributed to that choice I just made is totally different question. I mean, in the sense of where you're going to go with it. Why did I do that? Shuts. Why is that, to me, a very shutting down question?
It's blamey.
Yes, it's a blame. It has judgment in it all over the place. What could have contributed is a much more expansive. So I love questions. And I thought, oh my goodness, those go together. So I started thinking through, what do people need? They need powerful questions. They don't need me to answer them. They need good questions to launch their own journey. Mm-hmm. And so I did some cards. My first deck was called Morning Inspiration. And they're cards that you can just take one in the morning and, just kind of look at it and either journal or reflect on it, things like, how can I keep it simple? Of course, now I have 52 of them and I'm struggling to come up with them. How can I keep it simple? How could I make this day more meaningful? Or, just stuff like that. So Morning Inspiration was just all kinds of angles of questions. Then I did a goal setting, card deck, which I wish I wouldn't have called that, because a lot of people are like, oh, goal setting. I wish now I would have called it intention, or I'll probably revamp it at some point, but just setting some intentions around different domains in my life. And I was working with my team and they're like, Connie, you have to do one on deconstruction. And I'm like, you're right, I do. Oh, fun. It ended up being a double deck. So I take in this deck, I ask questions and here's the other thing. I use card decks. I like it way better than journals, because in a journal, there is a space allowed. There is an order. And I don't like that. I'm like, no, you get to decide how much space and time you want to take with every question. You get to shuffle the deck, order that baby, toss that question. OCD people like me have a journal. And if they're asking a question, I've got to fill out for every question.
Right.
There's rules that we still have to get rid of sometimes. But a card deck just says, no, this is my question for the day. And so I decided to go for a card deck due to the idea of agency and saying, I get to decide which of these questions are important. So finally, I got to this idea of deconstruction in making a deck. They're the questions I ask, Janice, you and I were talking, you're like, oh, these are some questions I go through. I'm like, right, because we're therapists. And I think there's some of the questions that get me the best expansive answers. And then the second deck is present evaluation and reimagining. I kind of did a half deck a piece in there, but it's divided into three, where you've got the reimagining. This is for people who still want to retain a faith, and for people who are like, no. Who? Why? And I say that in a letter I send with every deck, saying, this is toss the cards that don't apply to you.
Mhm.
It's fine. So, but the reimagining is, I take even some existential issues about meaning, about, life, about what do I think about the world now?
Mhm.
Uh, so, yeah, bigger existential issues in that. And just to say, be expensive, find out what you want. So that's kind of, the decks are really, I think they're a lot of fun. And they're fun for you to talk with other people about. The
Mhm.
personal reflection, but also, hey, do I got a couple friends? We could go through these and kind of talk it through.
Right. Yeah. I really appreciate the cards because they're so creative. It's such a creative way to also, like you said, help people launch off into different directions. Well, what do I think about this? What do I think about that? Some of the cards in the deck don't apply to me because I am an atheist and I don't hold any belief to the supernatural. But there are other cards in the deck that are very thought provoking. And I just really appreciate the work that you have put in on your resources. And I also appreciate you coming on the Divorcing Religion podcast today
Oh,
to share your story with us.
what a privilege. What a privilege. I love you. We were talking about the work you're doing earlier, Janice. I'm like, oh, girl, keep going. So needed. And I love getting in touch with you because now I have resources to send people to you for resources.
That's right.
So yeah, you're doing some
Excellent.
great, great stuff. So
Well, ditto. Thank you for joining us, Connie, and everyone.
yes.
Thank you for joining us today on the Divorcing Religion podcast. A quick reminder for you to get your tickets to the Conference on Religious Trauma. They're available for sale now, and this year's conference will be held in October. And the links for that will be in the show notes. I'll also have some links for Connie for her website and how you can get a hold of these marvelous cards that we've been talking about. Quickly, what is the name of your website? How can people get to you?
Question mapping. It's actually question-mapping.com. So, and
Okay.
that's more for my cards. I have another one, ConnieABaker.com, for all the religious abuse. Got a bunch of free videos, material, podcasts, stuff on that. And then there's some other
Excellent.
stuff for purchase as well. So
Right on. Thanks for that. Okay. Well, I hope that our paths will cross again, Connie. If I'm headed out to Portland,
I
I'll be
hope
giving you a
so.
shout ahead of time because that would just be such a treat to get together. And thanks, everyone. Take care of yourselves, and we'll see you again soon.